Hello, in this video we're going to look at various different ways of incrementing and decrementing variables. So we've seen that in our video on while loops that we had to increment a variable, and that's such an important thing to do, and there are various ways to do it. So we're going to look at some of them here, and that's going to sort of, although it might not seem very important now, we're going to find that this is going to be quite enlightening as we progress through the course. So let's start off with a variable here. I'm going to make it of type int, and I'm going to, let's call it just count, and set it equal to 0. So what we did to increment our variable for our while loop was we wrote this, something like this: count equals count plus 1. And we've already gone over that, so I won't go over it again. And then if we output it, then, okay, it started at 0, and so it's going to be 1 now. And if we just run that, we can see the value 1 in the console. Of course, if I started it at something else, like 11, and I increment it, it will be 12. So there's no great mysteries there. Nothing special about 0 here. Now, there are various other ways we can do that. So one way is we can use the same operator that we previously used with strings, plus equals. So I could say here, let's increment it further. So I could say here count plus equals 1, and then we'll output it. So what we're doing here is we start off with count at 0, and then we're adding 1 to it by the most basic kind of simple method. We're outputting it, and then we're adding 1 to it by another method and outputting it again. So we expect to see 1 and 2 in the console. Now what this does is plus equals is exactly equivalent to count equals count plus 1. It's equivalent to that. It's like a sort of synonym for it. The plus equals operator takes the existing value of a variable and adds something to it, or it kind of looks like it does that, at least with strings. With strings, you use it to concatenate more text to an existing string, basically. And in fact, with strings, what you're really doing is creating a completely new string and assigning the original string reference to refer to a new string. That's not important. We'll leave that aside for now, but I just wanted to mention that. So yeah, we're taking count and we're adding 1 to its existing value using plus equals, and we'll just run that. Let's run it. So we've got 1 and 2 coming out in the console there. So let's increment it by yet another way of incrementing variables. Let's do count plus plus semicolon. So this is the increment operator. There's some subtleties to this, but I'm going to leave them aside just for this minute. Let's just output this already. So that does it in this case, it does the same thing as these other statements that we've got. It's just going to increase the value of count by 1. So now with these statements here, you don't have to increase the value of count by 1. You could increase it by anything you like. We're just specifying 1 here as it happens. In this case, it specifically increases the values of integers by 1. So you can't use it to increase them by 10 or something. It is going to be 1. So what we expect now is to see that after we've done that, and if we print it out again, its value will now, at this point in the program, it will be 3. So if we run this, we see it's 3. So we've got 1, 2, 3. Another thing we can do is this, plus plus count. And don't forget the semicolon, of course, as usual. And if we output that, this does almost the same thing as this. So if we run it, indeed it's increased the value of count to 4. Now this is called the postfix version of this operator. Postfix meaning after, it's kind of fixed on after the variable. This is the prefix version. Prefix meaning, well, a prefix, it's fixed in place before the variable. There is a difference between this and this, but we won't look at it in this video. We'll talk about it in another video. So we see here that there are 4 different ways that spring to my mind, at least, that we could increase or increment the value of a variable, of an integer variable. First way is this, count equals count plus 1. We can also do count plus equals 1, or count plus equals whatever other number we want. And then we can use a postfix increment operator, count plus plus, or we could use a prefix increment operator, plus plus count. So I would suggest trying those out, but actually, before you do that, let's look at decrementing the variable as well. So I can do the same thing in reverse. For every increment operator, there's a for every way of incrementing this, there's also a way of decrementing it. So if I say count equals count minus 1, that's going to take the value of count, subtract 1 from that value, and at the moment we're then holding that new value temporarily in memory, and then assign that new value to the original variable. So this has the effect of subtracting 1 from the value of count. I'm giving you explanations here, but that is to try to, hopefully you'll understand bits of my explanations at least, but the real learning will take place when you type this out and try it and even experiment with it. So if we now run this, then we get 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we decremented it and we've got down to 3 again. We can also decrement using this kind of a technique. So instead of plus equals, we can do minus equals. Let's do count minus equals 1 and sys out. Let's run this. So now it's down to 2. So this is precisely equivalent to this. Let's just format that to get rid of that blank line. Well, that doesn't work. Oh yeah, it does. Okay. So this and this mean exactly the same thing. We can also do count negative negative or count minus minus. So that's the postfix decrement operator. And that works just fine. So if we run this now, it's down to 1. And finally, we can do a prefix decrement operator. We could do this, count minus minus count. We could have used any of these methods in our while loop, sorry. Well, any of the methods that increment it, at least. So let's run this, and we get down to 0, which is what it was to start with. And to make that clearer, actually, after I initially assign a value 0 to count, let's put an initial sys out in there. So it starts off at 0, we increment it 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're decrementing it by various methods 3, 2, 1, 0. Now what I'd suggest is that you type all of these yourself, either one after the other, or just try them. Just create a program, increment a variable in it like this, run it, check that it works, and then change that to this. So get this to work. Once you've tried them all out, try to write this program from memory. That is, start with a variable that has some value, for example 0, and then increment it by each of the 4 different methods, and then outputting it every time afterwards, and then decrement it by each of the 4 methods, outputting it every time. If you can be bothered to do that, that'll help fix all these different operators in your mind, and then you'll feel more confident when we actually start using them. So in other words, try to replicate this program from memory, but I'd probably suggest, unless you're feeling confident, that you try each of them out individually before you try to do it all without referring back to this code. Have a go at it and see how far you get. Okay, so until next time, happy coding.